Hey guys, what is up? And I am here today with a Disruptor mod guide. Now, while the Disruptor itself might be new, it's basically a strong arm which has been around for several years. So all of the standard strong arm mods that you would normally do should apply to the Disruptor. But just to mix things up, I'm going to try a new painting technique out and see how it goes. But without further ado, let's get started with what you'll need. Okay, so like I mentioned, I'm going to do a bit of a different painting technique, try something new. I sort of came up with this idea by accident, but basically I'm going to be using three different types of paint, red, a metallic silver, and a black, and then a clear coat if I like how it turns out. If not, I'm just going to sand it off and start over again. So please watch the whole video before attempting to follow along if you want to do the paint process exactly like I'm doing it. Other than the paint, though, we're just going to do some standard Springer mods to this. So we got some Teflon tape just in case our seal isn't quite up to snuff. If we do that as well, we're going to use some silicone grease. Make sure it's rubber safe. In this case, mine is. Just because you don't want to degrade that O-ring and it'll ruin your blaster over time if you use something like WD-40 that's not rubber safe. Other than that, though, we're just going to need a few different grits of sandpaper, going from a relatively coarse grit to something smoother before paint, and then a few various hand tools. I just have a few screwdrivers over here, which are just my standard Nerf screwdrivers, fit most of the screws that Hasbro uses. I did forget to mention that I like to use a magnetic parts tray. It's not really necessary. However, not losing the screws when you're taking apart the blaster is a huge bonus, so I recommend some sort of mechanism to hold your screws in place while you're modifying, so that way you have them all when you need them at the end. Okay, so all of the main body screws, which I just removed, are the same. The only real different screws are the flathead, which holds in the trigger, and there's a small silver one which holds in the slide return, which you have to remove in order to fully disassemble the blaster. But that's not too difficult. For those of you that are familiar with the layout of the strong arm, this is basically the same. You have the trigger, you have the catch mechanism back here, the plunger tube, the turret, the rotation mech are basically all of the same. I don't remember exactly when, but Hasbro switched from doing the little spring and piece to these just 100% plastic pieces, which are good because I guess that's one less piece to lose, so we'll put that away just to make sure that we don't lose it. Orange tip I'm just going to lay aside as well, and basically the next step for me is just going to be removing all the internals, and then I'm going to start by checking the seal, and then if that's good, then I'm just going to move ahead to some bodywork. Pause the video now if you need a quick internal shot for reference later on when putting it back together. For painting purposes, actually it looks like you could pop the shell apart in the various three stages of different plastics by just popping out these tabs and removing this screw, which will be really nice later on for getting a multicolor paint job. It's a little difficult to see, so I'll try to reflect the light off of it, but basically the first mod that I'm going to be doing is just using a tiny bit of glue to plug up this pin release hole towards the front of the blaster, which lets out the excess air. Okay, so after plugging the air release hole at the front, I tested my seal just by putting my finger over the front and then just moving the plunger back and forth, and I'm pretty happy with it. I don't want to add too much Teflon tape under it, because under the O-ring, because then it might create too much friction and slow down the speed of the plunger head, and that's not really what I'm looking for. Plus, this blaster is going to be pretty much a loner for me anyway, so I don't want to do something like remove the air restrictor, where people who aren't super familiar with modified blasters might dry fire it a lot, and that could damage the internals over time, which isn't really something that I'm looking for either. That being said, though, if you are looking to beef up your Disruptor-strong arm a bit more, there are plenty of aftermarket springs that you can purchase, or things of that nature that you could drop into the blaster that are very easy to add. That'll give you a lot more of a performance boost than just plugging the air hole. Moving on to the shell, as I mentioned before, it's really easy to split it into multiple pieces, which will make color paint schemes really easy and really cool looking for this blaster. Even if you're not an experienced modder who's really good at taping things off, you can still get a really clean multi-stage paint job with this blaster. That being said, the only real bodywork I need to do at this point is remove a lot of the warning text and logos and stuff like that just from the main shell, as well as things like I believe the slide has just a It's kind of hard to see, but there's a ton of text on here. So I'm just going to go through, start with a relatively rough grit sandpaper, and then work my way down to a 200 and something grit sandpaper, and then I can prime and paint the blaster. Okay, so after a ton of hand sanding, I'm finally at a point where I think I am good to go. All the pieces are really smooth. I went down to 220 grit, and I think that's fine before paint. After doing all of the hand sanding, I definitely recommend washing off the blaster with some very warm water and soap, just to get all that dust off of there from the sanding process, and then leaving it out to dry, and then we can go into our base coat. I'm going to start with a flat black, as that's very easy to build colors off of, and especially with like Nerf products, usually there are many different colors, so it really helps to get a solid base coat before you start building up your intended color on top of that. Okay, as you can see here, we are just finished up with the second coat of paint, which is currently drying. The main body itself is actually going to get 2 more different colors of paint, and that's just to sort of test this new paint scheme I'm working with. But I'm really a fan of the black and silver. It's pretty simplistic, but when done well, it really looks good together, so I might have to do that for a future paint job. And as you can see here, I've painted the inside and outside of the pieces. That's sort of like a pro tip, I guess. It helps your blasters look a lot more complete, especially along like the seam lines, because if you only paint it spraying down, you can miss small spots, and then it makes your paint job look a little more sloppy. So I recommend painting both sides of the pieces just to help make your paint look a little bit better. So most of these pieces are now done with their paint, as they're only getting the colors, and I'm going to do my 2 more coats on the main body, and then we'll go from there after that's dried. Okay, so now that all of the paint has dried, I'm really happy with how a lot of these different colors came out, and I really like how the overall paint scheme looks. I'm kind of upset that I'm going to have to start sanding away at this to sort of reveal some of the underlayers to do the weathering technique I wanted to try, but that's sort of the whole reason that I went through putting the 4 different types of paint on here, and why it looks a little bit thicker than it normally would if you just did like a light coat, which is ideal. This obviously the paint looks a little thicker because there's 4 different types of paint under there, but I'm really a fan of the paint scheme, and I'll probably do it again for future blasters. But for right now, I'm going to take some light grit sandpaper and start just testing the weathering on this main red piece, and then if I like it, I'm going to proceed and do the rest of the blaster. If not, I'm just going to repaint this and stick with the red. Okay, so now when I'm working on weathered builds and things like that, and paint jobs of that nature, I always find that there's a balance you sort of have to keep if you're keeping a lot of the orange components, mostly because they are by default very glossy and clean looking. So what I like to do to sort of weather the orange bits while still keeping them orange without like going over and painting them a whole different color, I take a very light grit sandpaper and sort of sand off a lot of that shiny glow, and then I'll do my standard weathering with just a little bit of black paint. I'll rub it on and then try to rub most of it off, and that'll leave a really cool effect, like you can see here. Just a little, I'm still in the process of doing this one, but you can see there are very small things of black just to sort of accent it, and it's not very reflective compared to something like that, and it looks a lot more in tune with the rest of the weathering. So now that I'm finished dry brushing, I actually touched up some of the little areas with silver, mostly where you could see the blue shining through. After I did the sanding, it was a little more difficult than I thought it would be, just to sand off only 2 layers. They seem to almost like want to all come off together, which is kind of a pain. I thought that between the 4 layers there would be enough of buffer, but basically how I fixed that was I just very lightly touched up some of the areas with silver where some of the blue was shining through from the base plastic color, but it's not really a big deal because it looks pretty good now in my opinion. I ended up painting the turret of the blaster as I ended up painting the cylinder of the blaster as well, just because I felt that it really gave a rounded out look to the whole blaster. With this being silver, I thought that when it was orange it was just a little too much, and I don't really need it for the orange tip because we have this piece up here, so I thought that the silver up here really complements the silver back there, and a little bit in the handle as well, and really rounds out the whole look of the blaster. So this is sort of just a rough put together of what the blaster will look like when it's done. I'm actually going to go and clear coat it now with a matte clear coat. I don't think glossy would make sense for this paint job, and I really just want to seal it off because I'm probably going to use it for HVZ, and those things tend to get scratched or used fairly aggressively. So I'm going to go clear coat it so that my fake scratches don't get real scratches. Okay, so here's a quick shot of the internals back in place. The only thing that's really difficult to put back on is the catch mechanism back here, just because there's a little spring that's a little bit difficult to line up. But other than that, the only thing you have to remember is on the slide mechanism when you're putting that back together. There's a small screw that goes in right there. I almost forgot that. But other than that, we're going to get started by putting the shell back together, and then I'm just going to put a little bit of lubricant over where the slide would go, and that'll just reduce the friction and make it an easier prime, as well as help to avoid chipping any of the paint. So overall, I'm a huge fan of how this blaster came out. I think the weathering looks really cool, but I'm going to try out a few other weathering techniques that I've read about sort of while trying this one out. So there will probably be a few other videos about that, but as you can see here, the weathering is pretty prominent on the blaster, and I'm really happy with sort of how that looks, and overall the color scheme is really cool in my opinion. The performance isn't anything to write home about. It gained like negligible FPS, mostly from closing up that little hole. Before I was reading about 60s, and then now the average is about 63, and the high shot being about 67, which is nothing particularly impressive, considering there are, larger stock blasters that hit closer to that 70 to 80 range, but being that this is a small pistol, I will take it. That being said, this was also primarily a cosmetic mod, and if you did something like buy a stronger spring or things of that nature, you would obviously get more FPS out of this blaster. I'm really hoping that the sort of hammer shot arms race takes off with maybe the Disruptor, and we can get a more shot turret than just 6. It would be cool to see like an 8 or 9 shot turret for this blaster. I think it would make it more of a viable sidearm, but that being said, right now, for the hammer shot you can get up to 8 shot turrets, so it's a little bit silly to have this when you can have something that's 8 shots and one-hand primable. However, this, in my opinion, is still really cool and very fun to use. Anyway, that brings this mod guide to a conclusion. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video.